Greetings and welcome to Black Religion Books, the official podcast of the African and Diasporic Religious Studies Association. Visit us and find out more about what we do at ADRSA.org. I'm your host, Iya Funlayo, PhD, the founding director of the ADRSA, and I am thrilled to be here today with Dr. Darnise Martin, who is a professor at Loyola Marymount University and co-editor of Women and New and Africana Religions, as well as the author of two books, 40 Something, 10 Radical Lessons for Women on How to Live and Love Without Losing Themselves, and the book we will be discussing today, Beyond Christianity, African Americans in a New Thought Church. Welcome, 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 Dr. Martin.
Thank you for having me. Happy to join you.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you, and I'm thrilled for this discussion today. I would love to start us out with some information about you, a little bit of your background, where you grew up, where you went to school, and what led you into the study of religion.
Oh, wow. That's a mouthful. Okay. I'm from Ohio, from Cincinnati originally, where I grew up as one of those kids who loved to read and go to the library all the time.
Hmm.
An only child, raised by the community, raised by the village of my family. And yeah, I was a shy kid and I spent a lot of time reading and writing. And I was always drawn to religion, um, like, I don't know, Egyptian and Roman gods or whatever. Like, I didn't know. I was just roaming through the library and I was drawn to certain things like that. And my mother would always say, "What is that you're reading? How do you get your hands on these things?" So one of my mentors says to me that we come into this life and we're kind of like reaching for what we knew from the previous. And so he
Hmm.
says, seems like you came in as soon as you got your feet on the ground, you started looking for like the next breadcrumbs of the spiritual trail. Where you had left off spiritually, you were grabbing already. I used to walk around with my grandmother's Bible, and when I was little, I couldn't even read yet, but it was big and it was like with the color plates in it. I don't know if you know those Bibles with the color plates
Yes.
in it, right? The white Jesus. And so walking around with it.
Really.
And my grandmother would say, "What are you going to do with that book?" And I said, "I'm going to read it." But I couldn't even read yet. So now, mind you, I grew up reading those type of books. I would make up stories, right? But when it
Hmm.
came time to go to school, go to college from Ohio, so I was looking at Kent State, I said, "I'm a major in fashion." And my mother said, "What? You should be a teacher or a lawyer. You like to read and write." It didn't connect for me that this was something that I could do as a career. I didn't really have academic people around me where I was like, "Oh, you can be a professor." To me, somebody who majored in religion was going to be a minister of a church. And my best friend's father, he was a minister of a Baptist church. And I was like, "Well, that's not what it is in my mind." Right. So I liked fashion as a hobby and I went off to school to do that. But lo and behold, my mother was right that I should be a teacher. And so,
Aren't they always?
right.
Right?
And of course, that interest never left me. And really, the ancestors never left me in terms of guiding me towards questions of spirituality, which we typically look to our religions to try to answer. And so basically, I grew up as that kid who had these kind of spiritual questions, and my mother couldn't answer them. She's like, "Why? You read all those books. Don't you know the answer to that? Or why don't you go ask, you know, the minister we knew, right? Why don't you go ask Reverend Atkins?" Then I would go and ask, and I would not have a good response. I'd be like, "I don't think that's the answer." But I was 10, I was
No,
12.
I'm not feeling that answer. You say, you sound so much like me.
I wasn't feeling that answer. At 15, I was like, that's the best you got.
Mm.
And so I was off and running on my own quest. And by the time I got out of college, Kent State University, then I moved to New York because, again, I was majoring in fashion and then I was in the fashion industry, right? And then I was like, "Oh no, this is terribly wrong. Something is terribly wrong about this." And I don't know. You could say the ancestors came to get me again, or, the inner vocation started to manifest. I started to find myself in company with people who were well, we might say the metaphysical, the pagan. I started to find myself in some unusual spaces for a little Black girl from Cincinnati, Ohio. But it
Hmm.
was just another sort of opening on my spiritual path for me to make some choices, for me to be exposed to a lot of different things, and then be able to come back like, well, let me kind of come back here and let me open up again here and come back here. And ultimately, those questions led me to have this great dissatisfaction. And so I always want people to know, if you have a great dissatisfaction with where you are in life, it's probably because there's something else pulling you.
Hmm.
And it
Come
was
on.
right. It was definitely pulling me. I was so dissatisfied with fashion. I was like, this is the worst thing ever. If anybody's ever seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, I was like, that was my nightmare. And I had to get away from it. And it was
Hmm.
a painful thing because it was like, no, really, the nudge is for you to come over here on the path where you really need to be. And
Hmm.
so eventually I was like, let me look at this. I'm in New York now. I said, so let me look at Union. Let me look at Union Seminary. And I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know nothing about James Cone, Black theology, nothing. And I started looking at it, and then I got an opportunity to go back to Ohio. So I went back to Ohio, ended up going to seminary, try to just make this a shorter story. Ended up going to seminary because the spirits, the ancestors were not going to leave me alone. Oh, no, you're
Hmm.
not getting ready to hide again in another fashion job. Oh, no, you're not getting ready to do that. Act like we're not talking to you day and night. So I ended up going to seminary for my master's, and then I ended up going to deciding to do a PhD program. So I moved to Berkeley, where I went to the Graduate Theological Union, and here we are.
Here we are. What a beautiful journey. I so appreciate you sharing that. And I always ask for our guests to share their journeys because oftentimes I think there's a perception, right, that those of us in academia sort of followed this straight route and knew what we were going to do. And
Mhm.
I love to hear the richness of our stories and how it's often a circuitous route. It's often
Mhm.
we go one way. I've shared with the folks that I've done some of everything there was to be done in terms of work and careers. And
Mhm.
ultimately, I love how you said it, the ancestors guide us to where we are meant to be. And so you've been guided to this place where we get to enjoy and benefit from your deep curiosity and the ways in which you have found your place in spirituality. And that really leads us into talking about this book, which was so wonderful to read and fascinating, particularly thinking about a religious tradition that we don't often associate with African Americans, as you say. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been another study like yours done since you did it. So it's still very important thinking about African Americans in New Thought and in religious science. And so you start the book off, and I was so grateful with this beautiful historical overview of these traditions for those who may not know about them or who may confuse them with other traditions like Scientology or Christian Science. Can you give us a little snapshot of that history and just tell us a little bit about what New Thought is, what religious science is for those who are not familiar?
Sure. Yes, a question I get all the time. Well, what is New Thought? For people to come back around and say, you know what? I guess I knew what that was anyway. But New Thought is a metaphysical religion. It's about consciousness, the idea that we are co creating our reality. And so certain things like The Secret has made that more somewhat commonly understood, but again, misunderstanding more than understanding. So it is an American religion that has its origins in 19th century New England. And because of that, 19th century New England, there weren't a whole lot, and there still are not a whole lot of Black people in New England. And
Right.
so this philosophical tradition developed among middle class and upper middle class white people, essentially. But it was about what they used to call the mind science. Like, how do I interact with this universe that we say is responsive? This is a vibrational universe that is, in fact, responsive. And this is what I mean when I say metaphysical. Like, what is the nature of reality? The nature of reality is that it's vibrational and it's interactive with us. And so now we're used to people saying, oh, you can manifest this, you can manifest that. And that's kind of what they're getting at. How do you manifest? You manifest because you are co-creating with the universe. You must be in alignment with the thing that you say you want. If you're not in alignment, then it won't manifest. So people are used to that kind of language, but they don't necessarily understand that it comes from a particular religious, at least broadly sort of spiritual religious grouping called New Thought. And so New Thought is this umbrella term that encompasses a few denominations, one being religious science, which now more commonly goes by Science of Mind, the Unity School of Christianity, and Divine Science. So again, those three denominations that fit under this umbrella called New Thought. But essentially, New Thought is, I like to say it this way from my undergrads. New thought is we can have a new thought about the power we have as humans in a spiritual universe. Our new thought is, what is it that you want to create? What is the world that you want to see?
Yes.
And if
Yes.
you step into the idea that you'd like to see a different world, either globally or for yourself, usually both, right? You want to see a different type of world globally. Okay, what would that look like? What if you spent your time thinking about co creating what you want to see rather than lamenting and being afraid of what you don't want to see?
Mm,
Right? And in your own individual life, what if you spent more time thinking about what you want to experience versus what you hope you don't experience. And so New Thought gives us tools to do that. ATM, we say affirmation, treatment, and meditation. So you affirm what it is you really want, and therefore you're able to align yourself with it, right? But what most people do, we manifest by default
mm,
because we habitually fall into thinking about what we don't want. We habitually think about how things are going wrong, right? So it's a practice, it's a spiritual practice to keep your mind stayed on spirit, as they say in the old church, right? It's a spiritual practice to keep your mind on what it is I want to create. What is the new thought that will bring about the new reality? And
mm.
so, I mean, I could go through the different denominations and the history if you want to do that. I don't know if you want to go down and talk about the film wars and, Ernest Holmes as the creator of Science of Mind.
Well, really, actually, one of the things that most fascinated me, we are here in Women's History Month and
Mhm.
Women's Present Month and Women's Celebratory Month. And
Mhm.
so I was struck by the two, I would love for you to touch a bit on the female founders, the ones who were at the helms of some of this
Mhm.
movement, because there
Mhm.
was, as I read the history and became more familiar with it through you, I was pleasantly surprised to know how deeply women were involved in this process.
Yeah, interestingly, New Thought has always had women at the helm.
Mm,
And it's an interesting story, but it's basically sexism and patriarchy is the reason why. Um,
right.
because women, a lot of women, again, this is 19th century New England, a lot of women were having physical ailments, illnesses that medical science had no answer for. And so women were still considered to be hysterical. And that was literally a diagnosis that you could get as a woman. You're just hysterical, meaning medical science didn't know what was going on with you. And so you're going to live with this. And so you were relegated to, okay, that's just how women are. Well, there became this group of people who are meeting together to meditate and to um, think about how spirituality could help them heal their ailments. And the group began, as you might imagine, a lot of women started to gather. A lot of women were sharing their stories. A lot of women were having healings. So
Mm,
that brings more women when some women are saying, hey, I'm having this. This is what's happening. So you get these gatherings of women who then have leadership roles because of course they're the ones having these meetings. I mean, there are some men around as well, but there was never a time in New Thought where men were saying to women, you can't do this, you can't lead, you can't. Women were already leading, it was already happening, it was already a thing,
mm,
like we're already present. And women who are considered what we would say now upper middle class privileged women, those were women, really the women who were making up those initial groups because they had sort of the time, the leisure to gather and to, be able to even travel through New England, let's just say, to go to different spaces. And now they're having salons, right? Now they're going, oh, I was in Maine, I'm going over here to New Hampshire, I'm going to Connecticut, I'm going into New York, because the movement is growing. So ultimately, I mean, we get the development of the different denominations, but what we see is women have always been at the helm. And basically, it was around the idea of spiritual healing.
Mm.
Women needed a healing because medical science was unable and kind of unwilling to really look
Right.
seriously,
Undesiring.
right? I mean, this is the story, too, if you were to go in this direction, the story of how we even get the vibrator today, right?
Please, let's go in this
Right.
direction. Very important.
Because, people may laugh and say, what, like the vibrator,
Was a medical device.
it was a medical device. Why? Because the idea was women are hysterical because their uterus is out of place. Your uterus has to be in its right place. And for whatever reason, which is your own haywire emotions, you're out of balance. And so your uterus is somehow floating around your body. Well, you need a man, and at the time you had to be married, right? And what if you're not married? Then you went to the doctor who would give you a massage, right? And that massage should end up in your happy ending. And so
And
you
put your uterus back where it's supposed to
like
be,
literally, right?
according to their kind of flawed logics. But,
Right.
even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Today, exactly. So if you didn't have a husband to go home and get with, here's this device. And they started off as these huge, enormous kind of devices. And over time, they got smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, of course, women understood this is not really helping me with my actual condition, depending on what her condition was. And so there was something happening in terms of spiritual healing or mind science, the mental. So what was that? Like, what was really happening? Well, women were coming together in prayer groups. Women
Mm,
were laying on hands with each other.
yeah.
Women were like, had permission because you were already considered kind of marginal and hysterical. Okay, so now when these groups start to take more organizational sort of shape, the women were already present. And so even if you had a group like, early on, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, there was some male leadership as well. The men were not saying, oh, y'all get to the back and nobody wants to hear from you. No, the men were like, come up here and talk about your experience of being healed.
hmm To
And
prove
so
that this
you
is viable.
exactly. And exactly. And
Mhm.
so a cousin to New Thought is Christian Science, created by Mary Baker Eddy. And she's an interesting story. She is an interesting story. Her church has survived. We still have Christian Science churches, and so you may not notice them, but when you see a church, you pass a church, and it says First Church of Christ Scientist.
Yes.
First Church of Christ Scientist. That's a Christian church, Christian Science church, or you'll see these reading rooms in some cities, Christian Science reading room. Mary Baker Eddy was around at this time, late 19th century, and she was a woman who had a lot of her own ailments, and she just was not getting any real help. And she went to study with Quimby. Quimby is the founder of New Thought, who was becoming renowned for his ability to heal, right? And so a lot of the women were gathering. So she was one of the women who went to him. Well, she ends up getting a healing. He passes away. She steps into the forefront as if this was all her show. But she ends up, because the other people in New Thought are like, no, girl, no, no, no. So
We
she
know the
ends,
real
we
deal.
know the real deal. Okay, okay, but don't act. So she ends up going and establishing her own church called Christian Scientist. But she is a very interesting character. As much as people want to say that they would say she's very difficult, right? And a lot of times these are the labels that get applied to women, right? Women in leadership, especially at that time. So I always got to take that with a grain of salt. Like, she was difficult. Well, she had strong leadership. She had a strong vision for what she was
And
trying
from
to
what she
create.
shared too, she was trying to protect her intellectual property, right? There was a place
Exactly.
where, as you explained, that she got more sort of radical and protective as people were taking her ideas and seeking to change them and
Exactly.
expand upon them and claim them. And she was very clear that, no, I'm going to get my credit for
Right.
the ideas that I came with.
Right. And so I have to give her credit. Like, she was, phenomenal to have in her mind a certain vision for what she wanted, what she believed in, and the power of faith to heal. And she was very committed to that. She was very rooted in that. And yeah, people would try to take from her, right? And so she becomes somebody who's very protective, and we might say hypervigilant. But anyway, so she's one of the women from that time period who creates a church, and it is still standing. Small as it is still standing. And people will say, oh, those are the people who don't go to doctors, right? Yeah, they don't necessarily go to a doctor. They're not forbidden from going to a doctor, but it is part of their faith statement that our healer is God. And that if you follow these scriptures and if you follow this way of life, then you can be healed. We can be healed.
Mm-hmm.
So it was no flash in the pan. Here it really still is.
Stands here. Yes, there's one right in Harlem on right off 125th Street.
Really?
Our Christian Science reading room.
Now,
Yep.
see, that's interesting.
Well, that leads us kind of to, so this intersection, of course, these women that we're speaking about now are white women, and this was, as you mentioned, a sort of middle class white movement. Talk to us a bit about what you talk about in chapter 2. How do now Black folks get involved in this? What are those intersections between this new thought, between Black spiritualism, Black Pentecostalism, and these places where Black folk begin to take up this science of mind?
Yeah, so interestingly, okay, I'm having a number of ideas too, but interestingly, it's Father Divine and Daddy Grace kind of tease New Thought into Black communities, and not necessarily like they were New Thought ministers and they were speaking New Thought from their pulpits. I would not say that. But what they were doing, they were modeling. And so by now we're into the early 20th century when I talk about Father Divine and Daddy Grace. And so we're talking about men and ministries that are about creating better realities for Black people. Now we are talking about these two particular men who have become successful, who are rich and successful, and they have a degree of power in their communities. And so then they are talking to their congregations and the community about, this is how you can have a better life. First, you have to believe it, right? And then they'd go into the scriptures, right? And they would say, it is done unto you as you believe, right? When you pray believing you already have. And so we get those type of ministries happening, and more Black people who are in the Northeast in general. Now, New York, Philadelphia, it's broadening out beyond New England. But you have Black people who are like, oh, okay. So now as we're moving along in time and we get into the 50s and the 60s, now we get Reverend Johnny Coleman, who is rooted in the Unity School of Christianity, the Unity denomination, and we get Reverend Ike, right? So Reverend Ike in the 50s, some people don't really realize that Reverend Ike was active in the 50s and the 60s. We, those of us of a certain age, I guess, might remember that he was on television in the late 70s. And I know, or the mid to late 70s, because my grandmother used to watch him. And as much as people would talk, Black people would talk about Reverend Ike, that he just on television and want your money, he had a captive audience. And he was very clear about, you are creating your reality. We are co-creating our reality. And that's New Thought all day long. And the Reverend Johnny Coleman, we can't skip her because she is absolutely paramount. She is foundational. She is known as the mother of New Thought, this African-American woman who got her start in New Thought through the Unity denomination started by Charles and Merle Fillmore. She gets her start with Unity. Now, here's this very progressive metaphysical religion, right? We're like, oh, surely we don't have this thing called racism looming among these progressive white people. Oh, but indeed, right? It shows itself.
Always.
It shows itself. And so she says, I don't need to play these games. Let me just start my own, right? So Johnny Coleman leaves Unity and she goes and starts her own church. That church is in Chicago, Christ Universal Temple in Chicago. And she ends up starting her own denomination of New Thought, which is an African-American denomination. It's called
Mm.
the Universal Foundation for Better Living. So she doesn't out of the, just start the whole thing at once. This is a progression of her starting with that first church in Chicago, Christ Universal Temple. Now here she becomes well known throughout Chicago. Like she's still, her name, she's passed on, but her name is still very important in Chicago, interacting with all the other Black ministers in Chicago, right? Having a large congregation, telling Black people, you are co-creating your reality. Which way do you think? Remember, I was talking about, let's have a new thought about the world we want to experience,
Right.
both globally and in our own homes. What do you want to experience? And again, it's a spiritual practice. People think, well, how am I going to do that when rent is due and I don't have the money? Or, this is happening, that's happening. This is why it's a spiritual practice, because we come together to say, I know it looks crazy out there. It looks crazy out there. And so, what do we need to do? Affirm, treat, meditate. Treatment is another word for prayer. We say that we treat for one another because what am I doing? I'm trying to treat your mind because I know that you're being overtaken by the chaos in the world or the chaos in your own mind, the chaos in your own household, depending on what you got going on.
Right.
What is it that's going on that you need to conquer that? You need to let go of some old belief systems that have taken root because that's what you inherited from grandma and your parents. It's just the family story. Okay, well, how much longer are you going to carry that family story, or are you going to get a new thought?
Mm.
And so
Mm.
Johnny Coleman was enormously important to Black people in New Thought, really everybody in New Thought. And so we have a lot of her churches all over the US, into the Caribbean as well. Um, there's a seminary. So it really branched out and became a whole denomination unto itself. And
Mm.
then, as we know, Reverend Ike became a precursor. Well, he became a televangelist. I would say the precursors for televangelists were Daddy Grace and Father Divine, right? We can definitely draw a straight line and say, okay, these are ministers in the media, on television. You can improve your life. This is how you do it, right? Joel Osteen is on TV doing New Thought every week. And people, I'm like,
Mhm.
what? This is New Thought. And he wouldn't say it. He wouldn't come out of his mouth and say it because he has to appeal to his evangelical Christian base who don't want to hear that their religion has anything to do with
With
anything.
these esoteric woo woo woo
Right,
metaphysics or whatever their
right,
classification of it
right.
is.
Which they're going to
Mhm.
call a false doctrine. But quiet as it's kept, his father, John Osteen, was well affiliated with the Word of Faith movement, which was New Thought.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
people don't know these terms. It's just a lack of people don't know these terms.
Right.
And
Well, and the ways that it's become weaved in very heavily with Christianity. And although it's not strictly speaking a Christian denomination, there's a lot of weaving in of Christianity and use of scripture to undergird the thought processes and
exactly,
the doctrine.
exactly. And I
So
would say,
that syncretism that you speak about in the
yes.
book.
And I would say a lot, probably most African Americans who are in New Thought do come in through
Mhm.
Unity School of Christianity. So they really do foreground Christianity and Jesus as a way shower, not a savior. So New Thought says we don't need a savior because there's no such thing as original sin. We're not born sinful. So we don't need a savior. What we do need is a way shower, someone who literally says, come this way, right? Like, this is how you do this, right? So Jesus is
This
considered
is how you walk. This is how you live. This is how you heal.
exactly, this is how you think,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Because we know that in every time there's chaos going on, right? There's chaos outside, there's chaos within. You may be living in a home that's violent, it could be anything, right? Okay, so how do you create a path for yourself if you want to think a new thought, right? And hear all of these things coming at us. And so You could say, have a metaphysical understanding of what we even mean by, the adversary, or, the devil, whatever. What is the devil? The adversarial thoughts that you have, that we have, that weigh us down. We're trying to create a new thing. What is the immediate thought that comes? You can't, right? You can't because. And so a new thought, you have an opportunity to observe, think about what you think about. Are you
Mhm.
aware of what you think about? Because again, most people manifest by default because they're not aware. They'll say, oh, I want to be happy. Well, what does that mean for you? I
Right.
just wish I didn't have all these bills. I just wish I had a job that paid better. Like, you're talking about the things that are problems. But can I get you to have a new thought and think about the things that are the solution? By default, you just keep reproducing this whole thing where you don't have enough money or you have illness. You'll be in that loop. Can I
Right.
get you? So by the time I find East Bay Church of Religious Science in Oakland, California, and I have moved myself to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, to go to graduate school for my doctorate. And lo and behold, I find this New Thought Church, East Bay Church of Religious Science in Oakland, the subject of the book. And I find the most dynamic Black woman minister, Reverend Eloise Oliver. I mean, Reverend E was all the things, right? And so she came out of the
Sounds
Pentecostal,
like it. I loved reading about her.
Church. And she would say, she always used the term old church. She said, now in the old church, we just call this the Holy Spirit, or we just call it this, or we call it that, right? And she said, but in New Thought, we talk about consciousness. We talk about elevating your vibration. And she said, whichever way you want it to be, right? And she said, because there's one God, there's only one God. A premise of New Thought is monism, oneness. There is only one. And so whatever shows up in life, it's still the one,
Right.
right? It's just, what piece of it are you working with? And so she
Mhm.
would tell us all the time. Now, you can come talk to me if you want to, but you got one good time to tell me a story about what was.
Hmm.
And she said, we're not going to keep going back over what happened. And she said, some of y'all come, we've had 3 services on a Sunday. And she would say, some of y'all want to come and think I'm going to listen to your story from yesteryear over and over again. And she said, I know some of y'all think I'm just heartless. It's like, because she goes, I'm going to stop you, right? Okay, we got one time to tell me about how everything went wrong. And nobody understands you, nobody love you, all that. She said, okay, get it out. Next time, what's the new thought?
What's the solution?
What's the solution? Because you want to go back into the old because that's, you're used to it. It's even comfortable.
Right.
And she's like, here's what's not comfortable. What New Thought challenges us all to do is walk in this spiritual practice towards where we want to go and align with it, right? We can't just say, I'm trying to win $1 million in the lottery. You're not aligned with $1 million. You know how I know you're not aligned with it? Because you don't have it. Not only do you not have it, but your mind immediately tells you about how you can't have it.
Right. Or why, what the problems are going to arise if you get
Right.
it.
Right. And
Mhm.
so a person who's more in alignment will say, like, let's start, $1,000. Let's just
Mhm.
say you had $1,000 extra per month. What does your mind tell you about that? And she'd have us write it down, like in church. She'd have us write it. Don't say nothing to nobody. What is your mind telling you? Well, I
Mhm.
don't know where that's going to come from. I don't know. Right. And I said, observe your mind. Think about what you think about.
Mhm.
And now just focus on how you would feel to have it. Just the emotion of how it would feel. Oh, I would feel such relief. Oh, I feel so in church, because my students often ask me, well, what's church service like? If you don't really believe in Jesus as your savior, what are you? I said, so it's instructional. And it's also a way of looking at the biblical scriptures and saying, what can we do with this that's not based upon a literal understanding about what this scripture is? What else? How do we apply it in our lives? And so that's what the church service would look like. And then we had the most phenomenal choir, and that
Gotta
people.
have a good choir. That's that's everything.
I mean,
Especially, well, as you mentioned, and what I really appreciate so much about the way that you analyze and think about the attraction of African Americans to this particular church, but also to New Thought and Science of Mind in general, is the ways in which the worship style,
mhm,
right, in this particular church mirrored some of what
mhm,
people were used to coming out of a Christian background. And of course, the music is a big part of that. The healing is a big part of that.
mhm,
And as well, you know, you go back and touch on even thinking philosophically, because of course, as I'm reading this and as I've read things in the past about New Thought, it comes right to the Yoruba philosophical concept of Ori, right? And why in Yoruba philosophy we say that anything that you desire, you have to ask your Ori. You have to inquire first of your own head. You have to
mhm,
inquire first of your own being and
mhm,
think of and feel into, are you, how you've prepared for it, how
mhm,
you believe you can have it, and all of these same types of things. So the
mhm,
same philosophies, and you point out that within African understandings of spirit, this idea of a responsive,
mhm,
co-creative world is there. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I really appreciated you bringing that in terms of thinking
mhm,
about why people of African descent would be attracted to New Thought.
mhm, mhm. Because we understand that the universe is responsive. You know, there's certain other people who look at the world as dead matter
Right.
for their conquering. Um,
Dominion. Right.
Dominion, right? And they've even created in previous decades the idea that God is dead and that I get to do whatever I want because it's all inert matter. Well, that's not the African way, right? Indigenous people all over the world look at the world as the expression, the outpouring of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
if I um, am mindful of that all of the time, then things will go well with me, right? In the Bible, it says, do this and this so that things will go well for you, right? And the African is like, yeah, we understand that we're in relationship with the world of nature, right? And so now there are deities that are associated with aspects of nature. And then, you know, people misunderstand that and say, oh, well, African people worship trees or river or whatever. And
Well,
it's
and
like,
if we do, we are right in doing so because they are manifestations of God, just like when we are worshiping God through the
right,
element of that tree or through the element of that
right,
water, through the element of that rock.
right. And their limitation, their limited understanding is you are, because of their own orientation, you are worshiping an inert set matter, right? It's dead matter. And the African says, like, what's wrong with you? Like, this
What's
contains
wrong with you?
contains the ashe of God, like of the creator.
Right.
And so this is an interaction here. You just don't get it, right? So anyway, African people throughout the diaspora have that fundamental spiritual understanding. And so then coming into something like New Thought that says, well, the universe is responsive. We're like, well, yeah,
Of
right?
course it is.
Of
Right.
course
This
it
isn't
is.
new thought at all. Right.
Exactly, exactly. And so I'm also a practitioner of hoodoo. And so, you know, I always say New Thought hoodoo because, and I've talked to other people who are basically similar to me, New Thought hoodoo. I said, now, you know, we don't really have to do any of these rituals, right? All is consciousness. And I can assert my thought into, you know, to my and impress my thoughts upon the universe and have it vibrationally come back to me. And in New Thought, we would leave it at that on that metaphysical consciousness level. Well, in something like hoodoo, we say, okay, well, what can I gather with my hands that puts me in touch with the pouring out of God?
With that
These
divine vibration in physical form,
in
as
physical
we
form.
ourselves are.
Right. So like if I gather herbs and leaves, if I am out by the river, if I am understanding that everything has ashe, then New Thought Hoodoo means I put those things together. And yes, in consciousness, I'm thinking it through. And then physical walking through the world, it's a continual recognition of the divinity of all.
Everything. Right.
And
Hmm.
so we were talking about, a friend of mine, we were talking about how much richer it makes both traditions.
Yes. Yes.
Nothing is inert, nothing is dead matter, right? And we can see the people who are colonial minded, we can see the way they operate through the world. It's like they just want to stamp on everything, tromp around on the world like, and say, this is mine, I own it now. Their very understanding is so counter.
Hmm.
And African people are like, indigenous people are like, that don't even make sense, because you don't know how to make one tree. I mean, I know how to plant a tree. You don't no, you start with a seed that was already here,
Right.
because the creator already gave us this.
Right. Right.
and and we also understand this thing called the spirit, the interactive nature of the spirit. We want to say the Holy Spirit, or Vodun, the Orisha. Like there's a visceral aliveness to God's presence. How do I
There's
interact with
also a physical manifestation. And so when we engage both our or read both our mind and the physical, we are literally recreating what it means to be human, to be
them?
at those crossroads of matter, because we are not just minds
Right.
floating around, but we are encased in matter. And there's a particular experience that we're having with this and with all of these various elements that we've been given to interact with, to live on, that are a part of our bodies.
Exactly. And so, why wouldn't we? I mean, I would say, as African diaspora, we can't help it. Like, if you go to an African American New Thought church, it is going to feel differently, because we've brought the African presence with us. We have
Right.
brought the drum. We have brought in the notion of divinity in such a way that it's here with us. You don't call it the Holy Spirit, but
Mhm.
there are other churches, white New Thought churches, where it is, I'm going to say, dry and crumbly.
Well,
We,
and that's across the board, right? When we think about the black church, as I always say, the black and black church is African, right? Our
right,
African sensibilities
right.
around the responsive universe, around possession with spirit, around the ways in which we are able to open ourselves to
Mhm,
become vessels of spirit,
mhm,
about the power that we have to
mhm.
co-create and not having to wait on anyone to come and save us, right?
Right.
All of that is a part of our understanding of the world as Africans, that we bring into Christianity, that we bring into New Thought, that we bring into everything that we get involved
Everything that we do, right? And then they look at us in astonishment, like they're astonished. Wow, right? And then you can kind of see how hungry they are for it as well, right? And
in.
they're like, "Oh, wow, this is amazing. You have such great music. Oh my God." Like you can just see like something awakens in them,
Mm-hmm.
or else they say, "Well, that's not dignified."
Right,
And we're
right.
like,
It's not
"Well,
respectable. And it's like, all right, well, but it ain't dry and crumbly either. So we're gonna keep what we got.
were you ready to go as soon as you got here?"
Right,
So,
right. Oh, I love this discussion so much, and I want to tap in a little bit as well too, to the particular, you tap in the book to the particular cultural context around California and Black folks in California, and why New Thought, although as you mentioned, there was this center in Chicago and started off in New England, but California has really become a place that has become known as a center of New Thought. Talk to us a little bit about that. What's that particularity in your own engagement happened in California? What's that particularity around California and Black people in California that has been a fertile ground for this?
yeah, well, the migration, right? People who were willing to go as far as California were people who were deliberately looking for something else
Mm,
different. I mean, there are certain port cities and all of that where Black people moved from the South, the Southwest, what was it, what? Louisiana, Texas, the Dust Bowl kind of area, went westward. And it was a certain freedom from conservative evangelical um, old ways of doing religion, right? There were those who intentionally fled, and then there were those who, by circumstance of seeking out, different kinds of work, got in a space where there was a more progressive um, way of thinking about spirituality. There's a different sort of soup in California, a milieu, right? A different kind of milieu, a different kind of soup in terms of the type of people, what they were looking for spiritually, much more progressive and liberal, I guess we might say. So then the Black people who end up out there become, sort of shaped by that. Again, those who deliberately wanted to leave those sort of traditional ways of thinking about everything, and then those who kind of find themselves in that progressive soup because they came for job opportunities. And so California presents this space where people could recreate themselves, and to dabble and to try things that maybe they would not have encountered in the Midwest or East Coast, things that, grandmama wouldn't have liked you going to that Unity Church. If she was, in Mississippi, you wouldn't have ever encountered those people. And if you did, grandmama would have said, no, you're not going over there with those people. They said, Jesus is not a savior, you're going to hell. And so, so, so here you in California, you end up meeting so many different types of people, and people who are, could be literally walking down the street, talking about their Ori, right? People who are literally living in the African, right? Or you meet some Asian people and you see that they're living into their Buddhism, and you're like, wow, okay, so now you end up with people who are more expansive in their thinking and at least willing to look and see. And so you get this particular kind of African American in California who is more open. I think this is the thought about California still, is that, okay, California is kind of its own thing, and culturally
its own world.
And I would say, having lived in a number of different places in the US, and then I lived in California for, I don't know, was it 30 years? Probably 30 years. There is something different about African Americans in California, and then different in the Bay and Southern California as well. There's something that is different, and it's hard to put your finger on it exactly, but we can say there are different kinds of life. I'll put it this way: racisms look different, and so that means people are shaped by it differently. And so if you come directly from the East Coast and you spend some time in LA, you're like, ooh, what's with these people, right? And then the people in LA are looking at you like, well, we're not slouches here, but we do it differently.
Right.
Likewise with religion and spirituality, we do it a little differently here. And when the sun is shining 300 days out of 365 and people are walking around in their flip-flops, people got a different kind of chill about them.
Right. You got more time to just consider the universe when you ain't got to bundle up in a bubble goose.
Right. And you're at the ocean and contemplating the grandeur
of the manifestations of God in a certain way, and living so close to that.
Exactly. And so when people are talking differently about, even let's just say Jesus, right? When people are talking about Jesus, but then you realize, oh, wait a minute, they said something different about Jesus. They said Jesus is a way shower. Yeah, Jesus is not. Jesus is a model for who we can become, who we can be, right? This human divine hybrid being. We're asked to be this human divine hybrid being, not to worship him as the Son of God and have that save us from our fallen humanity. We're to actually do that. We're to actually internalize that. Okay, so then as a Black person, you'd be like, well, I was raised on Jesus back home. Okay, well, maybe it's not so bad, right? And so it's an entryway for a lot of people. So the church that I went to in Oakland that we've been talking about, or church in LA like Agape under Michael Beckwith's leadership, there's always people coming in, and I'll say Black people coming in, who are expecting it to be a non-denominational Christian church. So many people I talked to, and they're like, well, I just thought this was non-denominational Christian church. And I was like, did you look at it at all?
Recognize that it's its own system.
Right. And then at Agape, they moved since I lived there. But at Agape, the artwork on the walls, even like you'll have a picture of Krishna, of the Buddha, right?
Mhm.
Of all these different Yogananda. There's pictures of different spiritual leaders on the wall. And I say, even though you're coming into this church and you see these people on the wall, you still thought this was a
You
non-denominational.
still was thinking you was gonna get some.
You still saw, but when people are used to a certain thing, they see what they want to see
Want
or
to
what they're
see.
comfortable seeing.
Mhm. Mhm.
And they're like, well, that's why that was non-denominational, but isn't this a Christian church? And I was like, well, Reverend Michael Beckwith, he would always say, come up higher. And by what he means is come up out of that literal understanding of scripture. Come up out of that limited way of thinking of Jesus as a savior for you on the other side when you get to the pearly gates. Come
Mhm.
up higher in your consciousness, right? And so here are these examples of these other spiritual leaders all over our walls of people, of beings who have done that and serve as a model.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
some people, they leave because
They're
they're
not ready.
they're not ready, and that's not the Jesus they know. And they say, well, y'all are what is the word? New age. They'll say new age. Y'all are new age and going to hell.
Right. It always ends with going to hell somehow. Whether you're going back to the African, whether you're going to something new, you're
Right,
going to hell. Right.
right,
It's
right.
always that. And I really appreciated this study, again, because as you note, it is a very much understudied tradition as it relates to African Americans, and there is a growing number of Black folks who are involved in New Thought and who, as you note, use it even when they don't directly claim it. And
Mhm.
as you conclude the book, you talk about some of the social and cultural implications that are associated with the growing number of African Americans who are in New Thought. And I would love for you to share what some of those implications are as you see it.
Um, well, it could change everything, right? What I mean by
Mhm.
that, because that's a big statement. Once we start looking at spirituality as a personally empowering thing, that changes the game in terms of religion, right? Using that term deliberately, religion being a very, very much a structured, regulated industry kind of a thing, and set of beliefs. But when people can tease out, oh, wait, spirituality is something that is within me, that I nurture within me. This allows me to have a way of interacting with the divine so that I am not um, caught up in the vicissitudes of this chaotic world, right? I am not limited by the priest who tells me I have to do X, Y, and Z thing at the Catholic Church. I'm not limited by, even what my rabbi might say over here, right? One thing about New Thought churches too, people come and do double and triple duty. They might go to their other church and go to their other temple and go someplace else. So people are multiply informed, as I say, and
Mhm.
New Thought. So once people reclaim and recover, oh, spirituality is something that should really be empowering me from the inside. Well, the implications are everything changes because now the churches do not have any more it doesn't have the same power. I'll say that. The churches do not have the same power. They don't exercise the same type of authority over me. So then it means that the nature of our relationship with churches and religion changes fundamentally because we now remember, oh, the power is really within me and I'm choosing how I'm going to be. And as we know, indigenous spiritualities are always about that, right? Relationship with the ancestors and with the deities and with the natural world, with one another,
Mhm. With the self. Mhm.
right? Fundamentally, right? Like you got to get to know yourself. As you know, people will run from that like the plague, but
The last thing, the very last thing they want to do.
but the relation. So basically, what I'm saying is the implications are enormous because it means that people become more empowered, which is what this whole game is. And I think what Jesus was really trying to say. I mean, certainly the Buddha. This whole game is you got to wake up.
Hmm.
And in order to do that, some things that you've been holding on to, some old thoughts, got to go.
Right. Detach
Will you?
yourself to reduce your suffering. It's
Right,
attachment to those old ways of beings that
right.
cause suffering.
Will you be made whole?
Mm,
The Reverend E used to say it all the time at East Bay Church of Religious Science. That's why she said, you got one good time to tell me that story. Because she said, every time I see you, I'm going to ask you, will you be made whole?
mm,
And we
mm.
know some people's identity gets wrapped up in their trauma.
Right. And then they're suffering and they're really not ready to heal, not ready to have a new thought because the old one is such a security blanket.
Right. Right.
Mm,
And,
mm,
and sometimes they feel like, well, I'm letting someone off the hook, or you're saying to me that that didn't hurt me or that it wasn't as bad as it was. It's like, no, we're not saying that. It's just saying, how much longer are you going to walk with that version of yourself?
right. How
And
long
so,
are you going to allow it to let you keep you there
right,
in that place?
right.
Mm,
And
mm,
so, literally, some people have resist that I've known of doing research and since who have a difficulty with new thought because it's like, well, then you're trying to tell me it's all my fault. And it's like, oh, well, it's not about
and you're
fault.
still stuck in fault. Even the
Right.
fact that you're leading with fault, there's no fault. We're saying
Exactly.
you are powerful and able to shift the
Right.
situation, whatever it may be. We're not
Right.
talking fault, but
Right.
that's also our conditioning and our indoctrination to think about
Mhm.
ourselves as sinful and as being at
Mhm.
fault. And so it's
Mhm.
so even as, as I bring people and share about Orisha and people come into African spirituality through me, one of the biggest challenges they have often is letting go of that thought of fault and sin and guilt and
Mhm.
shame and those heavy things that are precisely what we're attempting to emancipate ourselves
Mhm.
from through
Mhm.
both new thought as well as ancestral old thought.
Exactly.
Mm,
Exactly. And so now, many new thought leaders are really, how should I say this, sort of doubling down or trying to articulate in very concise language. What do we do for such a time as this? Because New Thought remains somewhat unknown or little known because we're not the people out in the street, right? When something happens, it's not New Thought ministers who run out, and they're at the protest. Although they might be, but you don't know that they're New Thought ministers or you don't know what it is. So
right.
how I am challenging New Thought leaders to say, well, how do we address the moments in which we live? What are we
Mm,
going to do about social justice in a more deliberate, loud way?
mm.
Because it's not cool really to say we've got this little secret over here, and if people can just elevate in consciousness then everything will be better, but at the same time we're not showing up and we're not giving them the tool, we're not showing them the tools. Like, what are we
Right.
going to really do about
And
that?
the world is being run by those who are clearly not in any kind of elevated consciousness. So we can't count on that as the
Right,
only way to liberation.
right. And so that is what I consider to be the next stage really,
Mm,
is like, because a lot of people won't know this, and I thought for sure it would have come out about Marianne Williamson.
hmm.
She's New Thought.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Very much
And I've
so.
met her at so many, I got pictures with Marianne, all kind of New Thought spaces. And I thought for sure it would have come out because the conservatives would have used it against her to say that she was involved in a new age, something cult. I'm sure they were going to come up with some language like that. And I was like, I'm just waiting for the day when somebody finds this out. But what
And
I
I didn't realize that wasn't common knowledge.
Well, because if they're living in such a small world of their own that they don't
Right.
realize this thing even exists. So everything
Mhm.
seems therefore like a threat, or they lump it together in what they call the new age. And
Right.
so anyway, some people have called her woo woo, but they didn't go sort of into what she was
To
really teaching.
specifically connecting her in with this new thought movement.
Exactly. A Course in Miracles, even like, oh, once they get a hold of that, Marianne, it's over for you.
Right. I'm like, what y'all seeing?
What's up? But
Wow.
anyway, she's a public person who could very well bring it in with her in a more deliberate kind of a way. But
Right.
anyway, she's kind of marginal again in terms of that the world stage. But
Mm,
I'm looking for especially Black New Thought people to say, look, how do we um, be more present? I've done a number of things for the Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary based in Miami. Taught some things online for them, Black and New Thought. Like, what are we doing about showing up? I mean, we got to show
mhm.
up.
Yes, I've been saying the same thing for us as practitioners. I think there's a
Mm,
very parallel stream in terms of us as practitioners of African spirituality, right? And not just focusing in on our own salvation, our own
mhm,
goals, our own uplift, but really
mhm,
thinking about how these principles can be more broadly applied to
mhm,
help liberate all, to help elevate and alleviate suffering and shift things
mhm,
in the world for the better. And how do we show up and show responsibility for our communities, which is our first principle as African people,
yeah.
that our community is everything, that we
Mhm.
need one another, that we are each other's clothes, as the Yoruba say.
Hmm.
So I really appreciate you bringing forth those particular implications in terms of how, those in New Thought now can show up, and particularly us as Black folk who know we still have a long way to go with so much. I want to turn for just a moment to one of my very favorite books, of which you are co editor. And especially again, as we are in this space of focusing on women, I appreciate so much the way that you highlighted the women in Beyond Christianity. And then this book, Women and New and Africana Religions, which I appreciate so much because it covers several different traditions, from Scientology to Islam to Orisha to Vodou, and it is organized thematically, which I appreciate.
Mhm.
Rather than breaking the traditions and organizing by tradition, there's the theme of ritual or the theme of sexuality and power and these various themes. Um, Talk to me a little bit about this book. I know it's you have some perspective on it now. It's been a minute since both of these were published. What have you seen as the impact that this book has had and the discussions that were brought to the forefront around women and their centrality in all of these traditions
Mhm.
that we're
Mhm.
discussing?
Well, I'll say initially when the opportunity opened, excuse me, I was like, really? I didn't even know if I was ready to do it myself. I was
Mhm.
like, and so it pulled me into a space of, as a woman scholar, right, pulled me into a space of leadership because, to edit a project meant I had to kind of coordinate a whole bunch of other people and their projects and helping them when they're like, I don't know what to say, it's a shepherding, midwifing kind of a project.
Mhm.
But, we always thought it was important because we still have this question. It's just almost an absurdity. Well, are women fit for leadership in religion, right? It's an absurdity, right? Or what are the things that women can do?
Or
Women cannot
family.
do that, right? Like this is an absurdity that we're still thinking about it in this way. Like, why is it that
It just shows the depths of the patriarchal indoctrination in
exactly,
the world, regardless of tradition, culture.
exactly? And so I began to really see it like that. Like this will be a contribution towards that. This
Mhm.
argument or discussion frustrates me. Like this is when people say, I think maybe it was my aunt, I'm not sure who it was who said, when you're looking for something out in the marketplace and you don't see it, then you have to be the one to write it. Like or when something really frustrates you, then you're the one to write about it. And so I have to say, especially now looking back, like, wow, there are other things I could have, maybe enlisted some other women to talk about this more. But at the time, it just wasn't in my mind to do so. But anyway, it's important for women's stories to be told within spirituality. And I kind of I say it like this because again, I'm frustrated that I have to. But at the same time, I want to leave a breadcrumb trail for, let's just say, girls and women coming behind in scholarship and they're looking for something that with a title like that, right?
Yes.
In a way, it's basic, but I want it to be easily accessible.
It was telling
And
us exactly what we're getting, and that's
right.
what drew me to it.
Right. And so here, for girls and women, anybody really, but particularly girls and women who say, well, I wonder where it is. Like, I don't think I can find it or what. And then use it as a springboard to go on and realize, oh, this is a much bigger conversation. And of course, women are doing all of these things. But here specifically where women are valued. So let's just kind of put the soapbox to one side and say, here are the things where spaces in which women are valued. Here's what we bring to the spiritual tradition. Aside from, it's not a question of what we're capable of doing, can do anything, right? And God is not a respecter of persons like that anyway. But okay, here's the ways in which
Right.
women and women's bodies, women's contributions, epistemologies are actually valued.
Yes.
And that's what I really wanted to participate in. And I'm appreciative to Lillian Ashcroft Easton as well, because she's older. And so she could help me, right, when I was kind of going off like, and why do we even have to do? She was older and could kind of say, well, this is why we're doing it in this way. This is
Mm,
why we're doing it in this way. And oftentimes we do need that older woman or older community to say to us, this is why we do it in this way.
right.
And then
And we need the young ones to say, here's why how we can change it, right? We need a little bit of that staid appeal to tradition as
yeah.
well as the innovation. And I think that comes together so beautifully in the work.
Yeah, so here I am saying, yeah, but, and so I can appreciate how it's accessible.
Hmm.
Recently, because I still am affiliated with a Catholic university, Loyola Marymount University, there's a new program that I would say I'm not really working on it, but in the Center for Religion and Spirituality at Loyola, there is a program happening around what is happening within Catholicism for women. What
Hmm.
are women's roles within Catholicism? And I'm like, sitting in these meetings on Zoom, right? Like, and they're having these conversations. And I was like, does it occur to anybody that we're still having the same old conversation? Like, really? This is the level. And with Catholicism in particular, it is the patriarchy is just stacked. It's just woke.
2,000 years worth.
Right. And so every little incremental conversation has to be run up against the whole
Right.
centralized authority, patriarchy, to even say that we're going to have this program. Well, who are you inviting? Is this going to be archdiocese approved? Where are you going to have this program? And who, and as a non-Catholic, I'm like, can we just have it? What
Can
are
we
you
just
going to say?
talk?
Right. What can we say about Mary? I'm like, well,
Mm,
Mary should be this point of freedom. I mean, this place, like the mother of God, the Theotokos, like the mother of God. Can we run with her? No, there's only certain things you can say about her.
mm,
And I was like, wow. So on one hand, you want to celebrate her, lift her up as the mother of God, but she only exists on a pedestal.
mm, mm.
And then in Latin American countries, they, because indigenous cultures, right, they do it a little different, do it differently
Right.
with her.
All the different versions, the syncretizations with the Mother Earth, like in South America with Guadalupe being Tonantzin, the Earth goddess.
Right. And so they're already saying, okay, well, we're not going to, okay, Father. Right. And then the syncretism happens as they infuse their own cultural understandings. And then you see that Mary has become much more liberated in
Mm,
those cultures, Latin American and African, right? As then, okay, now we into the whole African diaspora world of the embodiment of the goddess or Mary. But anyway, I bring that up just to say that I was sort of recently in this conversation about the role of women within Catholicism, and it's still such a very narrow conversation. And the Catholic women I was talking to, they were happy to be having the conversation, happy that the program was happening, but they kept sort of defaulting. I could see, and then they default to, well, what's the bishop going to say? What's the archdiocese going to say? And this is LA. And I was like, can you I said, you can't say that much. You got to get permission.
mm,
It's like, wow.
mhm. Well, and
So,
I'm always fascinated, and no tea, no shade, but I'm always fascinated by those of us who feel such deep allegiance and remain in these spaces that are so suppressive of us.
mhm,
I mean, what
mhm,
is it that, and I understand all of the mechanisms of
mhm.
how that happens, but it still fascinates me so much as
Exactly.
someone who was never able to do that, and who the ancestors tapped real early and was like, listen here, we not
This
doing
way.
that. Right, come over here. To where when I was, a very young child, I was like, we what now? Going to hell? Who sin what? Nah, I ain't with that. Like, I like the music, right? I'm with the choir. I like
Right,
the empowerment message, but the rest of this,
right.
I don't know about that.
Right. Like you said early on, we were similar with those questions because
Yeah.
it just hits you like, as a child, it hits you like, wait a
Mhm.
minute,
Something's not fair and something's not right here.
what kind of
I'm
story?
divine. I am just as divine, if not more, right? And so
Mhm.
I need to be able to express that. Such important work that you are doing, and I'm so grateful that we have gotten to have this conversation today. I want to touch just for a moment too on your most recent book, because it's different. It's not in the same academic vein, but it's so important as a guide for women and all of the things that we're talking about and the things that we often seek religion to assist us with
Mhm, mhm,
is this aspect of empowerment and this
mhm,
aspect of living well, loving well, and not losing ourselves in the process. So importantly, give
mhm,
us just a little bit about the impetus for that book and where that came from and where it's led you to.
mhm. Yeah, that book, 40 something. Well, in my 40s at the time, not now. um, I was going through some stuff, right? Like we do. And just encountering my own challenges, right, which were taking me through issues of identity and
Mm,
ways in which that I had been overgiving and people pleasing. Also, I was a life coach, still am, but uh, so I was beginning to see a common pattern among women in that decade of life, women whose lives are changing because of things in that decade, like, okay, children are older, um, some of people are getting a divorce. They're life-changing events happening now where we are able, invited, pushed into looking at ourselves. And here's always the spirituality piece, right? I always say life offers a spiritual lesson. Are you willing? Because we're always invited to see ourselves. Who have you been up to now? Is that no longer serving you? Okay, now what? So the impetus was for myself, okay, stuff is happening. Now what?
mm.
Because again, I'm not inclined to just stew in it. Now what? And what's blocking me from
You
my
ready
now?
for a new thought?
What is blocking me from my now what? And then I had all kind of stories. I had the old thoughts. I had all this stuff that I had to come to terms with. And in coaching other women, it was clear to me. Of course, it's clearer to point out somebody else's thing. It's clearer to be able to say to another woman, "Oh, I see. I see because you were raised this way, because you think this way. Now this is showing up in your life this way. Okay, what is the obstacle to you letting all that go and creating a new life for yourself?" And it just became like a common theme that I was picking up among them and myself. And so I thought I was going to be finished writing that book when I was still 40 something. But no, Spirit had other plans. And I couldn't figure out around like maybe age 48, why am I not able to finish this book?
Hmm.
Because it's essentially a self help book and it's really not that long, right? And so I was like, why does it feel unfinished? And other people were asking me about it. Other people had read little pieces of it, people I know. But I said, something about it feels unfinished. Well, right around 49 and a half, I don't know, I had a little shift. You don't have to tell everything in your whole life, just call it finished.
Mm,
Here's what you need to finish it, call it finished. There
mm,
will be more forthcoming,
mm.
right? It's as if I wanted to have a perfect ending somehow. And that was something
And
for me.
your life was still going. All right. There
And
was
see,
not, you weren't at the end.
right. And it was a spiritual revelation for me to like, wait, are you trying to Are you trying to still be perfect? Are you still trying to
Mm,
put a bow on this in a certain kind of a way? Are you trying to present something that's not? Therefore, you can't. So when I got that, I was like, oh, here's the spiritual truth that was coming in for me at like 49 and a half, which
mm,
didn't come in at 48, didn't come in when I was 47. It came in at 49 and a half. And I was like, oh, you're still doing that thing. Actually, here's the answer to the question. If you're thinking somebody's going to ask me, like, well, what about this? You didn't finish this or you didn't tell. The answer is that's what I have to say for now. We're in flux, we're in process. So
mm,
anyway, I wrote it in hopes that it helps other women navigate the ways in which they may have been overgiving and losing themselves in their own lives, because we
mm.
do typically go through those roles where we're
Right.
so pouring out that at any given moment we don't know who we are, we don't know what our goals are anymore.
And a
We don't
lot of that, of course, is undergirded by our religious upbringing from the
exactly
idea that suffering is saintly and that we should defer enjoyment and defer
right.
pleasure until the afterlife. All of these types of messages that we
Right.
grow up receiving.
Exactly. So, trying to help Black women in particular get free from a lot of this stuff that said you don't even deserve pleasure. I mean, pleasure? What?
What's that? Joy.
Joy, rest. Can I say no when something doesn't serve me? Am I allowed to say no? And
Mm,
typically, women would say, well, no, because I have to take care of mama. I have to take care of. And so the way into those conversations was, but what is it costing you? Your own health, your own peace of mind, your
mm,
relationship with your children, because yeah, mom might need help, but you're losing yourself, so you're not really present for either.
mm,
And
mm,
so women could get it that way. They could get it if I talked about, hey, but guess how, think about how you feel when you're depleted, and it can lead you into that wall of resentment and anger. But what if we could do it differently so it doesn't exhaust you like that? The
mhm,
reason you're at exhaustion and resentment, burnout, is because you're doing too much. And your own inner wisdom are screaming at you, girl, stop.
right.
And if we
Just
can just stop, right? And then let's reevaluate. So, anyway, that's kind of what that book has been about. And
mm.
people have asked me, are you going to write another one? And I'm like,
Yeah, we'll get a dispatch for the 50s now that, to share some of that wisdom. I know it would be absolutely welcomed, not to seek to extract more labor from a Black woman, but it would be welcomed, absolutely. This has been such a beautiful and rich discussion. I'm so, so glad that we were able to connect today. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, what's on the horizon for you.
oh, wow. Hmm. Well, I am
Any and
writing.
everything, I
I
know.
know. I am finally settling into writing a novel that has been on the back
Mm,
burner, in the back of my mind for years.
beautiful.
Um, and I really have just started with the writing. It's been there for years, as I said. So it's kind of evolved and it lives in my head, and it's not new. But it's new to me writing it. And it is a spiritual quest kind of a novel where a group of people are going on a quest for something.
Mm,
And unbeknownst to them, it's not about the object, right? But as the reader, I'm hoping to take the reader on this spiritual quest, which is always about ourselves, coming to greater knowledge about ourselves. And so I've got to take them on this journey to find this object, or at least think that they're going to find this object, but really they will find that all of the power that they have invested in external authorities will fail.
mm.
And so, you know, you've got to find your truth within
Find
yourself.
it in yourself, like the Shel
Exactly.
Silverstein poems, The Perfect Hive. If you want the perfect hive, find it in yourself.
Exactly. So I'm working on that. And I don't know. I think, I don't even know if I could really say, because things are in flux in a lot of ways. which I take as another nudge from the ancestors to say, it's time to shift a little bit. And, sometimes we are afraid. This is one thing I noticed too about people being willing or unwilling to make big changes in life is they're afraid that if I do and it's not right, then what? I'll feel like a failure or like I wasted time or money or whatever. And it's like, no, those experiences are necessary. And as you go along any one path, if that's not the thing, you course correct.
You turn at the next crossroads, as I always say. The embodiment in the Orisha tradition of Eshu, that you will come to another crossroad and you can turn a different way if you need
Exactly.
to, but you have to walk the path a little bit first to see if that's the
Exactly.
way for you.
And that's where a lot of people get hung up. And
Mhm.
usually I don't have that issue because I will walk a path and other people in my family, where are you going? And I'm like, well, we're about to see.
Going this way, and if it don't work out, I'll be back. Look, we are
Exactly.
so alike in that. So
And
alike.
because my personality tends to allow for me to do that a little bit more. I'm
Mhm.
exploring some things right now, but I definitely feel like one of the main things that my ancestors want from me is right, right. Because in my writing, I am doing spiritual work. I am
Yes.
leaving spiritual, I don't know, pebbles along the way for
Mhm.
other people's expansion. And that ultimately is what I hope that I'm doing is to invite people into their own expansion of consciousness. As Michael Beckwith says, to come up higher. And so, if it is in a fiction book that I write, that people are like, "Wow, I see. Oh, I get it. It's not about the outer thing." Yeah. So,
Mhm.
and then on the back burner too, there's always a hoodoo book that I want to write, but it'll be,
Mhm.
yeah, I do want to write that, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to it all. We look forward to it all. Send immense blessings to your work and to you. And thank you again for being with us, for sharing so generously of your time. Thank you all who have been with us, who have listened or watched. Please do check out the show notes for ways to contact Dr. Darnise, as well as links to get her books and to read more of her articles. And we will look forward to being back with you all again soon. Take care.